I'm talking about a feeling, right? Sometimes when I look at teachers and police officers who are doing their jobs, I wonder, how are they feeling in response to me? When they pull me over for a traffic ticket, how do you feel about this relationship? And some teachers are so stern in appearance, but I wonder how they feel. God's feelings are considered too nebulous to ponder. It's dangerous sometimes for people to assume they know how God feels. Theologically and spiritually, the usual approach is to stick with abstract, pithy formula, right? But we're told in Genesis 18, for example, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham bargains with God and says, will you spare these cities, for 50 people, for 40 people, for 20 people, for 10 people? And each time God says, I'll do it, right? I'll spare them. And the inference is God has pity, right, on those people, right? God has pity on the righteous who are among the wicked in Sodom and Gomorrah. Pity and compassion, those are feelings. In Exodus 20, right in the middle of the Ten Commandments, verse 5 gives us a little hint at God having what? Jealous feelings. God experiencing fits of jealousy. I don't know how I feel about God being a jealous God. The Psalms flip-flop in their representation of Yahweh. They describe him as having steadfast love, right? Love that will not change, and yet as being vindictive to those who scorn him. And so, you see, when it comes to the emotional life of God, the best we can say is that it's a mixed bag. It's hard to predict what God may or may not be feeling. In fact, when Jesus comes into the picture, we see Jesus cursing fig trees, right? Say I just came right in and started, hurling expletives at this plant. What in the world is Jesus doing cursing fig trees for not bearing leaves in season? And yet, on other occasions, you see him blessing the most unimpressive people in the population. Who are they? The meek, right? The meek. So, again, it's hard to get a sense of where God's feelings are in relationship to the world. I'm going to argue that no one should attempt to reason their way to God's feelings when they can't pinpoint their own feelings. Let me say that again. I'm going to argue that no one should try to reason their way to God's feelings when they can't pinpoint their own. Spend much more time, I think, asking yourself how you feel. And then offer to God those feelings. You worm Jacob. You insect Israel. What in the world? There was another place in the Hebrew Scriptures where the psalmist refers to himself as a worm, right? He says, but I am a worm and not human. But that's the psalmist, right, crying out to God saying, I feel like a worm. In this text, the prophet is putting these words metaphorically, figuratively, in the mouth of God. You worm, Jacob, right? You insect, Israel. And reading these pejorative expressions is disheartening. I don't know about you, but it's disheartening to hear God call Israel a worm. But what if the point of this name calling is the opposite of what we've come to expect, right? I don't know if anyone here has been on the receiving end of name calling, right? It's not a very pleasant thing. But if it's done in love, I wonder if it can work for us. At this point in Isaiah, Babylonian politics are giving way to Persian politics. Verse 25 says, I stirred up from the north, and he has come. From the rising of the sun, he was summoned by name. And if you're wondering who is being summoned, it is none other than King Cyrus of Persia. And according to Ezra, King Cyrus allows the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt and allows the men, women, and children to return to Israel, to go home, to have community once again. Things are looking up. History's gloom and doom is now evaporating in a burst of sunshine. If last week's message about judgment and warning were strong, this one turns the page from judgment to redemption. But why the insult? You worm, Jacob. You insect, Israel. Now, some of you know, we already mentioned that on Tuesday, our friend in Christ, Rick Enright, suffered a heart arrhythmia, and it left him unable to breathe. His wife found him, and his son performed the first round of CPR, pounding on his chest, really violently. And Caleb said it was hard because he heard a crunching sound as he did it. Paramedics then arrived, and they shocked his heart back into normal rhythm. And on the way to the intensive care unit, things looked really bleak. In fact, when I initially had contact with the family, I've never seen Sharon so despondent. But let's fast forward to today, until this very moment, as far as I know. There is reason to hope that Rick is on his way to an amazing recovery. So much so that I've given myself permission to remember Rick's wry and ironic sense of humor. You know what I'm talking about, Dan. Sharon told me, as we were standing there, right next to him, that Rick came home 4 weeks ago from church, and he said, Scott says I'm fat. And I went, I don't remember that. She said, yeah, I asked him then, what actually did he say? And then she said that Scott relayed that we should both do the 50-pound challenge, right? You know, and on that basis, Rick's saying, Scott says I'm fat, right? Just yesterday, I was standing there with his son Dylan, and Dylan, I don't know if you've ever seen him, really dark beard, strapping young man, you know, in his mid-20s, and I could picture Rick at that age. And so I looked down at Rick and I said to him, I said, Rick, look at this. He looks just like you before all the gray hairs, right? And the nurse who was standing by said, way to cheer him up, all right? Come on, you worm. Come on. Now, I don't want to overstate this. It is impolite to call people names. To indulge in hurtful epithets, in fact, may be a sign of mental illness. It's at least a sign, on many occasions, of poor self-esteem, right? If you're calling someone else names, derogatory names, it's a sign that you feel badly about yourself in some sense. Consider the N-word. You know the word I'm talking about? The N-word is a word that no conscientious white person should ever use. A black musician named Ice Cube appeared, however, on the Bill Maher show after Maher had used the controversial term in a joke. And Ice Cube said to him, you can't have that word back. It's not cool. Because when I hear my homie say it, in other words, a fellow black man say it, there's no venom there. But when I hear a white person say it, it feels like a knife stabbing you even if they don't mean to. Now, I want you to listen again to the caveat of what he says. He says, it don't feel like venom. When? When someone who knows my suffering says it. When my homie says it. See? And here I think there's a connection with Isaiah 41:14. Do not fear, you worm, Jacob, you insect, Israel. I will help you. How will I help you? Because I know what it's like to be treated like a worm, like an insect, like an annoyance. I just saw on cable this 2016 film. It's called The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation, 2016, co-opts the title of the 1915 silent movie by the same name, a G.W. Griffith film, famous film, that glorified the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. In this newer version, the 2016 version, it's the story of a real-life slave preacher. A slave preacher who used to preach to his fellow slaves in Southampton County, Virginia. And the white overseers liked him to preach because he would reinforce their enslavement. He would reinforce white supremacy in some sense. He would kind of calm everybody down. But eventually, things start to change when he starts to see how his fellow black slaves are suffering. When his wife is raped and beaten, when he baptizes a white man and he himself is beaten, his preaching begins to change from submit yourselves to your masters to I pray you sing a new song. Dishonor have all the saints. I pray you sing a new song. Sing a new song to the Lord. You see, what I discovered in that film story is that God may be in the process of absorbing and assuming all the malicious taunts we experience and making them something new. God may be in the process of taking to God's self all the pain inflicted upon us when people call us bad names. We already know from Psalm 137 how the Babylonian captors asked the Hebrews for songs. Our tormentors asked mirth from us. So we know it works the other way around. But it seems consistent with the incarnation of God and the crucifixion of Jesus to claim that God has a profound and deep empathy with anyone who suffers derision, with anyone who is laughed at and ridiculed. God has a profound and deep empathy for those who are laughed at and ridiculed and enters into it. Part of my call to ministry began, as I look back now, in 7th grade. I was a wild kid that had impulse control issues, and I was going to junior high, and I had some friends in elementary school, one of them named Bobby Haynes. Bobby Haynes was a weakling, or that's what we used to call him. And at the beginning of school, we would eat lunch together, but after a while, it became obvious that the more I would be with him, the more I would be associated with the lower tier of adolescent stuff, right? I would be a weakling too. I would be a maggot, a slug, a worm, just like Bobby. And so I started to disassociate myself from Bobby to the point where he really felt it. And Bobby started to bring in dollar bills and give them away to people so that they would be his friends, but they wouldn't be his friends. They would just continue to call him names and think how pathetic it was that he had to bring in dollar bills. And as I think back now, Bobby was the latchkey kid of a single mom who went home after school to an empty house and never heard anything about his father. And I just called him a worm. And one day, at the end of lunch, he came and his arms were swinging and he just pummeled me in the head. And everybody gathered around. The cool kid from science class said, "Hit him, Scott, hit him!" All I would have had to have done was just make one connection to his face and I would be a hero as far as they were concerned. But all I could do, to be totally transparent with you, was just grab his hands and bring them down to my side like this. And the vice principal intervened, and suddenly the crowd dissipated and we were standing face to face with each other. And Bobby says to me, "I wanted you to feel what it's like to be a worm." What if God is about this business, right? Absorbing all the taunts and the terrible ridicule that we experience. I want to just offer in closing just one last metaphor for what I think is happening. When we're inoculated with a vaccine, we're given a dead virus, right? The very virus that we're about to be infected with, perhaps, is introduced into our system as a dead virus. See? What if that's sort of what God is doing when he says, "You worm, Jacob, right? You insect, Israel"? He's kind of introducing into them a dead virus so that they can be inoculated against all the future crimes committed against them. It's something to think about. And I think here at Origin, we don't suffer many insults. But maybe we're going to be out there experiencing what God is doing. Let's pray.